I remember my first steps into the chapel of the Veiled Sanctum. It wasn't a grand entrance, no fanfares or ceremonial blessings. Just a creaking iron gate, a rusted lock, and the heavy, humid scent of centuries of disuse mixed with something else, something cloying and metallic, like old blood or forgotten fear. My assignment, ostensibly, was to catalogue neglected ecclesiastical texts, a purgatorial task for a scholar whose academic interests frequently drifted into the less sanctioned corners of Vatican archives. But this chapel, nestled deep within a forgotten wing of an ancient institution, was different. Its very air felt dense, heavy with unbreathed secrets. The few candles within flickered with an unnatural nervousness, their flames dancing as if in constant apprehension, casting elongated, restless shadows that seemed to writhe across the flacking frescoes. The silence here was not merely the absence of sound. It was a palpable presence, a suffocating blanket woven from years of unspoken prayer, unacknowledged sins, and unheard screams. It pressed in from all sides, a living, breathing thing that demanded reverence or perhaps obedience. The first rule is silence, the old, gaunt caretaker had rasped, his eyes like chipped obsidian before locking me in. He hadn't just spoken the words. He'd enforced them, his gaze a warning that chilled me to the bone. It was carved, too, above the sacristy door in archaic Latin, primum regulam est silentium, a stark, absolute command. I, a fool for knowledge, thought it merely an ascetic discipline. I was wrong. The silence was not for our benefit, it was for theirs. I began my work, my every movement a blasphemy against the chapel's profound quiet. Each rustle of parchment, each soft thud of a retrieved book, seemed to reverberate unnaturally, amplified by the heavy stillness. The air itself felt like a medium, carrying not sound, but impressions. Whispers that weren't whispers, presences that weren't visible. I tried to dismiss them as the product of isolation and an overactive imagination, a scholar's mind playing tricks in an eerie environment. But the feeling persisted, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the distinct impression of being watched, not by the absent caretaker, but by something far older, far more patient. My assigned task was quickly abandoned, drawn off course by a subtle anomaly. Behind a crumbling altar, partially obscured by a tattered velvet drape, I found a narrow fissure in the stone wall. Not a crack, but a deliberate, almost perfectly cut seam. My fingers, guided by an intuition that felt both alien and irresistible, traced the outline. It felt like a small door, perfectly disguised. The urge to open it was overwhelming, a primal, forbidden curiosity that scoffed at my academic protocols. I should have stopped there, should have respected the silence that guarded this place. But I didn't. I applied pressure, and with a soft, almost imperceptible click, a section of the stone slid inward, revealing not darkness, but a faint, unholy glow. Inside, nestled on a shelf lined with what looked like dried, pressed human skin, lay a single volume. It was not a book in the traditional sense. Its binding was a patchwork of various dark leathers, mottled and scarred, stitched together with rough, almost industrial twine. The surface was impossibly cold to the touch and seemed to absorb the meager candlelight, refusing to reflect it. There were no titles, no embellishments, only a single, deeply etched symbol on the front, an incomplete circle, bisected by a jagged, barbed line. It hummed with a low, inaudible frequency, a vibration I felt more in my bones than in my fingertips. I knew, with a certainty that transcended reason, that this was not one of the neglected ecclesiastical texts I was meant to catalogue. This was the forbidden book, the kind rumored in hushed tones in forgotten corners of ancient libraries, the one whose very existence was heresy. Despite the dread that coiled in my stomach, I couldn't resist. The silence of the chapel egged me on, pushing me into deeper transgression. I pulled the volume out. It was heavier than it looked, denser, as if its pages were made of lead. The air grew heavy, almost viscous, thick with the scent of ozone and something akin to burnt metal. I opened it. The pages were vellum, impossibly thin yet resilient, covered in a script I had never seen. It was Latin, Greek, or any known dead language. It was a language of angles and curves, of symbols that seemed to shift and writhe at the periphery of my vision, hinting at impossible geometries. Yet somehow I understood, not through translation, but through a horrifying, instinctual recognition. The initial sections detailed an elaborate cosmology, not of divine creation, but of a vast, indifferent void, populated by entities that predated light and form. It spoke of cycles of emergence and consumption, of ancient pacts made with things that lurked beyond the veil of perception. Then came the names. Oh, the names. They were not words to be spoken, but vibrations, patterns of thought that, when focused, could bridge the chasm between dimensions. Each name was accompanied by an intricate sigil, a diagram of forces and intentions. Veritas nomen, the text seemed to whisper, the true name holds power. These were not the names of demons from infernal grimoires. These were something far older, far more fundamental, entities that didn't desire souls, but merely existed in ways that shattered sanity. I kept reading, compelled, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I thought I was imagining it at first, the subtle shifts in the shadows, the way the candle flames elongated and dimmed with each revelation. But the book wasn't just imparting information. It was infecting me, permeating my thoughts. It spoke of rituals, not of sacrifice in the conventional sense, but of alignment. Circles of chalk, arrangements of specific minerals, certain intonations of sound that, when uttered in places of deep silence and ancient power, like the chapel I now occupied, could open pathways. Not gates, but thin places where the fabric of reality frayed, allowing them to peer through. The true horror, however, was the implication of conspiracy. The text was not just a collection of forbidden knowledge. It was a counter-narrative, a testament to what the Church, throughout its millennia, had actively suppressed. Not merely heretical ideas, but the very knowledge of these entities, their history, their true nature. The book hinted that the greatest secret of the Vatican wasn't divine revelation, but the meticulous, desperate concealment of the true nature of the cosmos, of the forces that truly held sway. It wasn't about protecting humanity. It was about protecting their narrative, their control. Mundus vult discipi, ergo discipiata. The world wishes to be deceived, so let it be deceived. But this book tore away the veil. As I absorbed more, the silence around me began to fray. It was no longer a suffocating blanket, but a taut drum skin, stretched thin, vibrating with an unseen tension. The nervous candles flickered more violently, their light struggling against the encroaching darkness. I started hearing things, not sounds, but a cacophony of non-sound, a chorus of psychic pressure, like countless unseen eyes focusing on me, drawn by the forbidden knowledge I was consuming. A tremor, not of my own making, coursed through the very stones of the chapel. The walls, those ancient, breathing walls, seemed to pulse now, faintly, rhythmically, in sync with some distant, cosmic heartbeat. My mind began to unravel. The clear lines of reality blurred. I saw patterns in the shadows that weren't there, caught fleeting glimpses of impossible shapes at the edge of my vision, limbs too long, eyes too numerous, forms that defied Euclidean geometry. The names in the book, those unspeakable vibrations, began to echo in the hollows of my skull, a silent mantra that threatened to crack open my very being. The silence of the chapel, once a rule, was now a desperate shield. I realized with a cold, paralyzing dread that breaking it, truly breaking it, not with sound, but with intention, with acknowledgement, would be an irreversible act, an invitation. I had crossed a line. By merely reading, by comprehending, I had acknowledged them. I had become a conduit, a vessel for this ancient, forbidden knowledge. The book, still open in my trembling hands, seemed to pulse with a dark, triumphant energy. It wasn't a passive object. It was an active participant in my undoing. The chapel was no longer just a place of enforced silence. It was a cage, and I, its newest prisoner. The candles, in a final, defiant gasp, dimmed almost to nothing, plunging the chapel into a near-absolute gloom, broken only by the faint, unholy glow emanating from the pages of the book. In that darkness, the unseen eyes felt closer, the psychic pressure heavier, and the silent whispers became a roar. The knowledge now burns within me, a corrupting fire that cannot be extinguished. How does one articulate the moment the veil thins, when mundane existence tears to reveal ancient truth? For me, it wasn't sudden, but an insidious erosion, like acid on marble. It began, as all such tragedies do, with a book. Not just any, but a forbidden text from the deeper, dustier sanctum sanctorum of the Vatican archives. My academic reputation, my whispered favors, opened doors meant to remain sealed. I told myself it was for research into forgotten heresies, obscure Gnostic cults, and lacunae in theological histories. I was a scholar, an objective observer. A lie. I was a moth to a flame, drawn by knowledge shimmering with fundamental truths, however unsettling. Brother Thomas, the old archivist, his skin papery as parchments, gave his customary warning. Non licet sire omnia, Dr. Richter. Not all knowledge brings peace. Some merely bring a heavier chain. I dismissed it, of course, as superstitious ramblings. I should have stopped then. I should have listened to the tremor in his voice, his eyes darting to shadows. But the scent of vellum and forbidden ink was intoxicating. I kept reading. I kept digging. And that, ultimately, is how I found myself in the subterranean crypt of the unlit devotions. The crypt itself was an anachronism, forgotten by time and light. Descending felt less like entering a building and more like diving into a cold, geological fault line. The air was thick, heavy, tasting of ozone and something indescribably old, like petrified fear. Then there they were, the altar black basalt gleaming, and atop it, the candles, an uncountable multitude stretching into the gloom, each flame burning with steady, unwavering light. My initial thought was intense awe. They defied combustion. The wax showed no melting. Wicks remained pristine, unsullied, eternally golden. They emitted no smoke, no scent, only light, a cool, ethereal luminescence that illuminated without truly dispelling the oppressive shadows. It was a paradox, a physical impossibility. Brother Thomas, reluctantly leading me, his face a mask of profound unease, merely intoned. They say they are fueled by faith, Dr. Richter. Unwavering, eternal faith. He didn't elaborate. The implications already pricked at my rational mind, but it was more. As I gazed, my vision struggling to adjust, I saw it, movement, not flickering but a subtle undulation, light and shadow within each fire, creating transient ephemeral forms, faces. I thought it a trick of the eye, but they kept forming, dissolving, reforming. Distorted, silent, watchful, some serene, others contorted in agony. Then Brother Thomas's voice, a dry whisper, shattered my reverie. The second rule, Dr. Richter. The most important, nunquam numera candelas, never count the candles. The warning echoed in the suffocating stillness. Never count the candles. Why? What esoteric horror lay hidden within such a simple act? My scientific mind, stubbornly clinging to logic, rebelled. Counting was classification, understanding, bringing order. To forbid it was to admit a profound, inherent danger in knowing. This was the true bait. I left the crypt, ostensibly complying, but the image of those unwavering flames, those fleeting faces, was etched onto my psyche. My research focus shifted. I was no longer pursuing forgotten heresies. I was searching for the source of the candles, the true meaning behind Brother Thomas's cryptic pronouncements. My investigations led me deeper into uncatalogued texts, into the heart of what the Church deemed too dangerous. I found references, oblique at first, in fragmented Latin codices, in scrawled margins of medieval grimoires attributed to excommunicated figures. Phrases like ignis eternus, eternal fire, and sacrificium conscientiae, sacrifice of consciousness. Warnings against the immemorial conflagration, a force consuming not matter, but truth, leaving only a hollow echo. I read accounts of hidden altars, of beings subsisting on esoteric energies, of ancient pacts made in the dawn of human awareness. The faces in the flames, they weren't just random patterns. They were, I suspected, the faint, lingering impressions of what fueled those flames. Not faith, but something far more visceral, terrifying, a collective essence, a sustained echo. My blood ran cold, but perverse, obsessive curiosity intensified. I felt a growing dread, a chilling certainty that I was peeling back layers of reality never meant to be disturbed. I thought I was merely studying ancient beliefs. But I kept reading, kept assembling the fragments until they formed a coherent, abominable whole. The pull to return to the crypt became irresistible, warping my every thought. I concocted an excuse for Brother Thomas, a need to re-examine architectural features. He looked at me with profound pity, but granted access, with a heavy sigh and a muttered Deus te salvit. It was less a blessing than a lament. This time, I went alone, armed with a camera and notebook, my academic pretense a thin shield against terror. The faces in the flames were clearer now. They swirled, coalesced, forming distinct visages of agony, grief, chilling watchfulness. They were countless. Then the compulsion. I had to know. I had to quantify. My hand, trembling, raised my camera. 1, 2, 3. Each click was a hammer blow against the thin membrane separating my reality. Numbering them, imposing order, felt like an awakening. With each count, the flames pulsed, a faint throb. As I reached 23, one face, a gaunt, hollow-eyed visage, solidified for an instant, its gaze locking onto mine with ancient, malicious intelligence. Its mouth opened, not speaking, but forming a silent, guttural sound within the flame, a wordless scream that reverberated through my bones. I dropped the camera. The sound was shockingly loud. My heart hammered. I closed my eyes, but the faces were still there, branded onto my inner vision, multiplying, swirling around me. They weren't just images, they were presences. The crypt's temperature plummeted and I felt a crushing weight. It wasn't just faith that fueled them. It was something taken, something extracted, eternally consumed. By daring to count, to impose my will on their ancient calculus, I had not merely observed, I had interfered. Not merely studied, I had participated. I had drawn attention. Their attention. I fled the crypt, scrambling up the winding stairs, the faces of the flames pursuing me, flickering in my peripheral vision even in normal light. Brother Thomas was nowhere. Perhaps he knew. The knowledge, once exhilaration, was now corrosive acid, eating away at my sanity. I saw them everywhere. In my monitor's reflection, in streetlight shadows, in my own frightened eyes. They whisper now, not with sound, but with insidious thought, planting suggestions, dredging up memories I never had. They tell me things about the true nature of the Vatican, about secrets buried not just in books, but in the city's foundations. They speak of names that summon, of rituals that bind, of the horrifying bargain that keeps darkness at bay or merely contained. I know I have violated an ancient trust, a sacred ward. The rules were not arbitrary superstitions. They were bulwarks against a reality too vast, too hungry for human comprehension. I should have stopped when Brother Thomas warned me. I should have turned back when the faces first appeared. But I kept looking, kept counting, kept pushing, until the fragile membrane of my reality tore apart. Now, the flame of my own consciousness feels perilously close to becoming another, tiny flicker on some unseen altar, fueling something I can never comprehend, forever watched by those silent, burning faces. I am no longer a scholar, I am prey. They are always watching, and I can never unsee what I have seen. I often wonder, in the dead of night, in the stifling quiet of this place, if the true horror isn't what I've learned, but the fact that I actively sought it. There are moments, brief and terrifying, when I almost wish for the blissful ignorance of before, for the days when the world felt solid, decipherable, without the gaping abysses I now perceive behind every sacred facade. But curiosity, they say, is a sin, and mine, I confess, was an insatiable, damning hunger. It led me deeper into the labyrinthine archives, past the Vatican's gilded lies, into chambers where the air itself seemed to vibrate with untold age and forgotten heresies. The silence here is not peace. It is the absence of truth, a vacuum that threatens to collapse in on itself, sucking the unwary into its suffocating maw. My work, ostensibly, concerned obscure liturgical practices and forgotten saints, a conveniently innocuous cover for my real pursuit. The apocryphal texts, the censored indices, the whispered histories of things that were never meant to survive the purifying fires of dogma. The librarians, ancient men with skin like parchment and eyes that seemed to have seen too much, offered polite resistance, their grip on the iron keys of the forbidden sections almost a physical barrier. But their resistance was always perfunctory, a ritual performed, as if they knew some souls were destined to transgress, drawn by an irresistible gravity towards the very knowledge that would unravel them. I was one such soul, and the more I read, the more I understood that the official narratives were but a flimsy veil over an ancient, terrifying reality. It was amidst these forbidden scrolls, these brittle folios filled with spidery Latin and maddeningly vague allusions, that I first encountered the warnings about the chapel statues. Not explicitly, not as a direct commandment etched in stone, but as oblique references, recurring motifs in texts that spoke of sentinels of silence and carven watchers. They appeared in treatises on protective wards, in accounts of monastic orders dedicated to containment, even in the feverish confessions of those who had gone mad attempting to decipher the true nature of certain holy sites. The third rule, as I pieced it together from a fragmented manuscript, a codex bound in something that felt suspiciously like human leather, was simple. Ni unquam oculos suos post occasum solis invenias. Never meet their eyes after dusk. The phrasing itself was a chill, a specific and unnerving caution that resonated far beyond the usual prohibitions against sacrilege. It was a rule born not of reverence, but of fear. The chapel itself was a place of serene beauty during the day, a cool, shadowed sanctuary where light filtered through stained glass in muted jewel tones. Along its venerable walls stood the statues, a procession of saints and martyrs, each meticulously carved from white marble, their faces imbued with a piety so profound it felt almost tangible. Their eyes, universally, were cast downwards, a posture of humility, of profound contemplation. I had passed them countless times, admired the artistry, perhaps even offered a silent prayer. But after finding the warnings, my perception irrevocably shifted. Now, when I walked among them, I felt a new, unsettling current in the air, a subtle vibration that hinted at something deeper than mere stone and sanctity. Their downward gaze suddenly seemed less like humility and more like a deliberate avoidance, a strategic denial of something they were perpetually observing. The first night I consciously acknowledged the rule, it was almost by accident. I had been immersed in a particularly dense passage, tracing the chilling etymology of a name, a casiel, that appeared to summon not a spirit, but a distortion of reality itself, when the last shafts of sunlight faded from the library windows. The chapel was on my way to my chambers, and habit pulled me towards its familiar coolness. As I stepped through the arched doorway, the air within seemed to drop several degrees, becoming thick, almost viscous. The stained glass windows, now devoid of external light, were opaque, black eyes peering into the gloom. And the saints, they were different. It wasn't just the deepening shadows that transformed them. It was something internal, a shift in their very presence. The shadows themselves seemed to stretch longer, possess a greater density than stone should permit, elongating into forms that writhed at the periphery of my vision. I felt a prickle of unease, a cold sensation at the nape of my neck. My gaze, drawn by an irresistible compulsion, drifted upwards towards the faces, and I saw it, or rather, I felt it. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift. The lines of their downward gazes, which had once seemed so fixed, now felt relaxed. Not looking down in humility, but resting, waiting. I quickly averted my eyes, a tremor running through me, dismissing it as the product of an overactive imagination fueled by too many late nights and too much forbidden knowledge. But the seed of terror had been planted. The texts, however, offered no respite. They spoke of such sentinels as ancient mechanisms, designed not to inspire faith, but to contain a presence, to hold back an encroaching, nameless thing. They hinted that the saints depicted were not truly the blessed figures of canon, but effigies, shells inhabited by, or linked to, something far older, far more inimical. My initial academic curiosity had long since curdled into a sickly fascination, a psychological breakdown in slow motion. I found myself drawn back to the chapel each night, an unwilling moth to a deadly flame. I would linger, just outside the threshold, peering into the deepening gloom, heart pounding, the cold dread growing with each passing minute. I should have stopped then, should have fled, but the words I'd read, the connections I'd made, were an invisible tether, pulling me closer. The names, the rituals, the vague descriptions of what lies beyond the veil of our reality. It all seemed to coalesce around these silent, watching figures. One night, emboldened by a foolish courage I now deeply regret, I decided to truly test the rule. The chapel was pitch black, save for the faint glow of the moon filtering through an unstained upper window, casting everything in stark, unsettling monochrome. The air was heavy, charged with an almost electric tension. I stepped fully inside, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud on the ancient flagstones. I walked slowly down the central aisle, not looking at the statues, forcing myself to keep my gaze fixed ahead. But the pressure was immense, a palpable weight on my consciousness, as if dozens of unseen eyes were already on me. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I could feel their presence, stronger now, more distinct than ever before. They were not merely stone, they were aware. I reached the altar, turned, and then, with a slow, deliberate movement that felt like drawing a knife against my own throat, I lifted my gaze. My eyes swept across the procession of saints, and that's when the marble lids twitched. It wasn't a blink, not yet. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible ripple in the stone, a microscopic shift, like the muscle beneath skin preparing for an action. Their eyes, once cast downwards, were now undeniably level. Not focused on me, not directly, but lifted, as if scanning the emptiness of the chapel, searching for something or someone. And then, as my gaze moved from one to the next, a terrifying realization dawned. Their shadows. They were stretching, no longer mere extensions of the stone figures, but independent entities, flowing outwards, reaching into the darkened corners, coalescing into forms that seemed to undulate, to coalesce and dissipate, just at the edge of my vision. They were no longer humble saints. They were sentinels, and I, in my arrogance, had just triggered their activation. I thought I was imagining it, a trick of the light, a figment of my unraveling sanity, until I saw it again, undeniable this time. The faint, almost imperceptible twitch beneath a saint's marble brow, like the briefest flicker of a dream. Then another, and another, a ripple of waking consciousness passing through the cold, hard stone. The gaze of each saint, once downward, now rested exactly at my eye level. They weren't looking at me, not yet, but they were aware of me. And their shadows, those things that stretched and writhed, seemed to coalesce into indistinct, spectral forms that were not of stone, nor of light, but something else entirely, something that pulsed with an ancient, malevolent life. I had stared into the void, and the void, it seemed, was beginning to blink back. Now I understand. The knowledge I sought, the forbidden texts I devoured, they were not just warnings, they were blueprints, keys. And by understanding them, by even daring to articulate the names of those ancient entities they spoke of, by even allowing my mind to conceive of the rituals described, I've become visible. The statues aren't just watching me, they're watching for me. And I can't escape their sight, not ever again. The rule of the door. It's the fourth one they impress upon you, a solemn pronouncement delivered with grave faces and eyes that seem to hold ancient, unspeakable burdens. Never try to leave after dark. They say it's for our protection, this great, unyielding oak portal that shudders shut with the final gasp of the setting sun. A heavy, ironclad sigh that reverberates through the sacred stone, sealing us within. No key has ever opened it once locked, they claim. A mechanism of divine intervention, perhaps, or simply a craftsmanship so profound it borders on the arcane. I used to find a strange comfort in its finality, a monastic peace in the enforced solitude, believing it was keeping the chaotic world out, allowing a focused, undisturbed contemplation within these hallowed, sun-drenched walls. I was a fool, of course. We are always fools when we interpret silence as absence and stillness as peace. My initial days here were spent in meticulous study, transcribing decaying manuscripts, poring over ancient liturgical texts. I am, or rather, I was a scholar, driven by the pursuit of knowledge, the uncovering of forgotten truths. The chapel's extensive library, a labyrinth of dust-choked shelves and whispering parchments, was my refuge, my sanctuary. The priests, those silent, watchful men who moved like shadows through the cloisters, seemed content to leave me to my work, perhaps seeing my academic fervor as a form of piety. They were wrong. My devotion was not to the divine, but to the obscure, to the secrets hidden between the lines of history, the margins of forgotten doctrines. It was this very impulse, this intellectual avarice, that ultimately led me to the forbidden shelves, the dark recesses where true understanding and true terror resided. I should have stopped when I first found the section marked non-legendum, not to be read. Even the Latin, normally so familiar, seemed to hiss from the spine of the first volume I touched. It was a heavy tome, bound in some dark, reptilian-like leather, its pages brittle with age, smelling of ozone and dried blood. My fingers, accustomed to the smooth vellum of saints, lives and papal decrees, recoiled slightly from its rough, almost living texture. But I kept reading, of course. My curiosity, a monstrous, hungry thing, compelled me forward. I told myself it was for academic rigor, for a more complete understanding of the chapel's history, of the strange faith these priests practiced. But deep down, a colder, more primal part of me knew I was on the precipice of something far grander, far more dangerous than mere scholarship. The texts were not historical accounts, not theological treatises, but something else entirely. They spoke of the interdictum, the forbidden act, of a hidden cosmos parallel to our own, glimpsed only through ancient, half-forgotten rituals. They chronicled a lineage of beings, not angelic, not demonic, but something older, something beyond human conception of good and evil. They contained names, not words, but guttural assemblages of sound, phonemes that seemed to twist the very air when I whispered them in my quiet study, a nascent dread blossoming in my chest. Veritas obscura, dark truth, one passage read, describing the true nature of the great door. It was not built to keep things out, but to hold something captive, a pact made centuries ago, renewed at sundown, a constant reaffirmation of a fragile boundary. I thought I was imagining it until the first night the rattling began. It wasn't the wind, not some structural creak from the chapel settling into its nightly slumber. It was a rhythmic, almost insistent thump-thump-thump, emanating from the base of the great oak door, a sound like a vast, unseen fist knocking, patiently, inexorably. I would freeze, book open on the lectern, my breath catching in my throat, listening, utterly terrified. The priests, if they heard it, gave no sign. Their faces remained placid, their prayers murmured with an unwavering cadence. Were they deaf to it, or simply resigned? I began to watch them more closely, observing their rituals, their odd, repetitive gestures, their hushed conversations in a Latin so archaic it barely resembled the liturgical tongue. I saw fear, a deep, abiding terror, etched into the lines around their eyes, hidden beneath their expressions of serene devotion. The books, these forbidden grimoires, became my obsession. I devoured them in the quiet hours after the door sealed, under the flickering oil lamps, my mind a storm of ancient symbols and horrifying implications. Vatican conspiracies, whispered warnings of sects dedicated to the architects of silence, entities that predated God himself. The names repeated, subtly altered, hidden within psalms, woven into tapestries, carved into the very stone of the chapel's older sections. I began to see patterns everywhere, a horrifying tapestry of dread that had been meticulously, terrifyingly laid out for centuries. The chapel was not a place of worship, but a cage, and we, the unwitting inhabitants, were the bait. One night, driven by a foolish academic impulse, or perhaps by something darker that had begun to seep into my own mind from the pages I consumed, I tried to translate a particularly convoluted passage. It was a description of the threshold guardian, the thing bound to the door, the thing that rattled. The text spoke of a particular sequence of sounds, a key of utterance that could either reinforce the seal or horrifyingly weaken it, per obstat, per apatum, by obstruction, by opening. My mind reeled. Was this the secret they guarded, the true purpose of their unending vigil? I felt a sudden, profound nausea. My fingers trembled as I traced the foreign characters, the syllables that felt wrong on my tongue, even in my thoughts. The rattling intensified that night, growing from a persistent knocking to a frantic, clawing sound, as if something with immense, desperate strength was trying to tear its way through the ancient wood. The entire chapel seemed to hum with a low, resonant vibration. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out the horrific sound, but it seemed to echo from within my own skull. It wasn't just noise. It was hunger, a palpable, suffocating desire that permeated the very air. The books had changed me, warped my perception. I wasn't reading about monsters anymore. I was hearing them, feeling their terrible presence just inches beyond the barrier. My psychological breakdown was complete, a shattered mirror reflecting the horrors I had invited into my mind. I should have burned the books. I should have fled the moment I understood the true meaning of the non-legendum warning. But I kept reading, kept searching, desperate to understand, to find a way out, to grasp the full extent of this ancient, malevolent conspiracy. Now, the knowledge is a poison in my veins, a whispered accusation in the dark. The door rattles, not from outside, but from within me. Or perhaps the truth is even worse. The rattling is me. I have become part of the lock, part of the key. And the entities outside, they know my name now. They know I'm here. The air in my study is thick tonight, a cloying blend of old paper, dust, and the metallic tang of fear. The lamp flickers, a pathetic defiance against the encroaching shadows that seem to thicken in the corners of the room, not just from the lack of light, but from something more substantial. I've been poring over these texts for weeks, months, ever since I first breached the Vatican archives, those hushed, unholy crypts of forgotten knowledge. Each page I turn, each forbidden word I decipher, feels like another nail hammered into the coffin of my former self. I should have stopped, I know. I should have turned back the moment the cold grip of the first rule settled into my mind. Never seek what sleeps. But a scholar's curiosity is a cruel master, a relentless hunger that gnaws at the soul, promising enlightenment while delivering only dread. Tonight, the fifth rule occupies my thoughts like a malignant parasite. Never answer when it calls. Such a simple directive, yet fraught with a terror I'm only now beginning to comprehend. The it is never specified, of course, not in the initial cryptic warnings, but deeper in the marginalia of a certain 16th century papal decree, De Vocis Tenebris. I found it, a reference to the campana sign manibus, the bell without hands. A bell, it stated, that rings only when the barrier thins, when the veil between this world and the other becomes translucent enough for its sound to bleed through. The text described the sound not as an auditory phenomenon, but as a percussion of the soul, a vibration that resonated with the very structure of creation. Foolishly, I thought it metaphor. I push away a pile of brittle, leather-bound folios, their Latin script swirling before my eyes like agitated ants. My fingers trace the worn parchment of the Liber Campanarum Sacri, a text so anathema even its title whispers blasphemy. It's here, amidst descriptions of elaborate, long-forgotten summoning rites and rituals to bind primordial entities, that the true nature of the fifth rule begins to coalesce. The bell, it explains, is not a physical object in any single fixed location. It is a resonant frequency, a fundamental tone that emanates from certain points on the globe, or perhaps from certain points within the psyche itself, whenever a particular confluence of esoteric knowledge and cosmic alignment occurs. And tonight, I fear, that alignment is upon me. Midnight approaches. I can feel it in the creeping chill that no amount of fire in the hearth can dispel. My watch, an heirloom from my grandfather, ticks with an unnerving precision, each second a hammer blow against my sanity. 1 minute past 11, 59 minutes until the hour. The Liber describes how the bell's sound is like ribs struck with iron, a hollow, echoing resonance that bypasses the ear entirely. It suggests that the bell is not merely a signal, but a question. And to answer, even unwittingly, is to invite the gaze of that which should never be seen. I scoffed, of course. A sophisticated form of psychological suggestion, I told myself, a fear mechanism embedded in ancient texts to deter the overcurious. But the chill persists, and a knot of dread tightens in my stomach. I find a particularly disturbing passage, transcribed in a cramped, almost panicked hand, detailing an account from a sequestered monastic order in the Alps. The monks, dedicated to the suppression of apocryphal knowledge, describe how a brother, a scholar much like myself, became fixated on the bell without hands. He believed he could understand its mechanism, its purpose. He sat night after night, waiting until 1 midnight he felt it, the vibration, the hollow strike. It began, he wrote, as a faint tremor in his sternum, spreading outward through his ribs, then his skull. He described it as a bass note that sang not to his bones, but from them. He felt his own secrets, His hidden fears, his suppressed desires begin to rattle awake, rising to the surface of his consciousness like drowned corpses. The more he resisted, the stronger the resonance. The more he tried to ignore it, the more clearly he heard the bell speaking his name. And then the final, chilling sentence in that monk's hand. I answered. I acknowledged its summons, and now I am its herald. My breath catches in my throat. My name, the bell calls your name. A shiver, colder than any winter wind, runs down my spine. This isn't just about some abstract entity, it's deeply personal. It seeks a connection, a resonance. It seeks me. I clench my fists, trying to ward off the growing sense of panic. This is madness, sleep deprivation, the oppressive weight of centuries of paranoia seeping from these pages into my mind. I need to close the books, walk away, let the midnight hour pass in silence. But I can't. My eyes are glued to the page, my mind transfixed by the chilling narrative. My hands, seemingly independent of my will, reach for another volume, a companion text marked Voces Obscuri. This one contains transcriptions of what are purported to be the actual calls or answers to the bell. They are not words, not truly. They are sequences of tones, or more accurately, intentions expressed through psychic resonance. A specific name, a thought form, a desperate plea. One entry, written in the oldest script, describes the answer as a whisper of the self, a pure acknowledgement of the summons, a spiritual amen. The clock chimes, deep and resonant, 12 strokes, midnight. My entire body tenses, expecting a sound, a physical noise. There is none. The silence in the room is absolute, deeper than before, almost suffocating. My heart pounds a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and then I feel it. It's not a sound, not really. It's a pressure, a deep, pervasive vibration that starts in the marrow of my bones. A low thrum, like a giant, invisible tuning fork, has been struck against my very skeleton. It starts in my sternum, just as the monk described, a hollow thrumming that makes my chest cavity feel like an empty drum. It spreads quickly through my arms, my legs, up into my skull. My teeth chatter, not from cold, but from an internal tremor. The sensation is profoundly unsettling, deeply invasive. It's like my own bones are singing, resonating with an unearthly frequency. And then the secrets. Oh God, the secrets. They don't just rattle, they erupt. Memories vivid and terrifying that are not my own. Images flash behind my eyes. Hooded figures in ancient catacombs, chanting in a language that twists my tongue into grotesque shapes. Faces, pale and gaunt, gazing at me with eyes that hold eons of suffering. A symbol, a swirling vortex of shadow and light, burned into the back of my eyelids. It's too much, too overwhelming. My mind reels, struggling to distinguish my own identity from the flood of foreign knowledge. This isn't just a bell, this is a conduit, a siphon for all the suppressed horrors woven into the fabric of existence. The vibration intensifies, focusing now, not just as a physical sensation, but as a psychic summons. It pulses, a silent, rhythmic beat that feels like it's asking for something from me, demanding a response. And deep within the chaos, a single, undeniable thought emerges, clear as a bell, cutting through the terror. Answer me. No, the rule, never answer when it calls. I grip the edge of the desk, knuckles white, trying to fight the compulsion. It's a primal urge, an instinct like holding your breath underwater. But the pressure is immense, the vibration unbearable. It feels like if I don't acknowledge it, my very being will unravel. My mind screams, resist. But my will is weakening, eroded by fear and the sheer, overwhelming force of the resonance. A word forms on my lips, unbidden. A name whispered on a breath I didn't even know I was holding. A name I didn't know I knew. It's not a human name, not in any language I understand, but a sequence of guttural sounds, ancient and potent. It's an acknowledgement, a surrender, a spiritual amen. The moment the sound leaves my lips, the vibration ceases. Abruptly, the silence that follows is even more terrifying than the cacophony it replaced. My body shudders, spent. I'm drenched in sweat, trembling uncontrollably. But the cessation of the bell's internal ringing doesn't bring relief. Only a profound, chilling sense of emptiness, followed by an even deeper dread. The secrets, the memories, they haven't vanished. They've settled, embedded themselves within me, a part of my own history now. And in that vast, echoing silence, I am no longer alone. I feel eyes on me, thousands of them, watching, waiting, because I answered. And now the true calling begins. I should have stopped when I still had a choice. But now it's too late. I am just another echo in their endless, horrifying symphony. They say the true horror isn't in what you see, but in what you know. They say ignorance is bliss. I used to scoff at such platitudes, dismissing them as the comforting lies of those who preferred their worlds small and manageable. My world, I always believed, was large, infinite in its capacity for discovery, bound only by the limits of human understanding. That was my fatal flaw, my academic hubris, the very lens through which I viewed the universe. I sought to understand, to uncover, to dismantle the protective veils of mystery. Now, I understand, with a chilling clarity that strips me bare, that some knowledge is not meant for the living, that some truths are best left buried under centuries of consecrated dust and forgotten tongues. The very air I breathe now feels thin, stretched over an abyss I've glimpsed, an abyss that has now glimpsed me in return. I found myself in the chapel of the Veiled Sacrament, a place whispered about in hushed tones, even within the Vatican's most ancient, secluded libraries. It wasn't officially listed, of course, a mere footnote in a discarded inventory from the late 15th century, described only as a place of quiet contemplation for the keepers of the elder doctrines. The flickering candlelight, perpetually low and warm, threw long, dancing shadows that played tricks on the eyes. It was always cold in there, a pervasive chill that seemed to seep not from the stone, but from the very essence of the space, a cold that settled in the marrow of your bones and refused to leave. I had been tasked with cataloguing a collection of unbound vellum leaves, a task that felt more like penance than scholarship. Each page filled with script so minuscule and archaic, it felt less like reading and more like deciphering the thoughts of a desperate, long-dead scribe. It was during these lonely hours, surrounded by the oppressive silence broken only by the rustle of brittle parchment and the distant echoes of my own anxious breath, that I became acutely aware of the rules of observance. They weren't written down anywhere, not officially. Instead, they were passed orally, a series of prohibitions whispered by the old archivists, their eyes heavy with unspoken things, their voices barely audible above the perpetual hum of ancient regret that permeated these hidden halls. They spoke of not looking directly into certain shadows, of never repeating particular names, of always carrying a blessed iron key. Most of them seemed like quaint, superstitious warnings, relics of a bygone era when faith was a shield against a much more tangible darkness. But then came Rule 6. In the chapel of the Veiled Sacrament, the oldest archivist, Brother Thomas, had intoned, his voice a raspy whisper, "Every visitor casts a shadow under candlelight, but one kneels even when the body does not. The sixth rule is this: do not acknowledge the kneeling shadow." He looked at me then, his eyes, usually clouded with the detached wisdom of age, suddenly sharp, piercing. "To see it is one thing, my son. To acknowledge it, that is quite another." I remember nodding, feigning understanding, dismissing it as the ramblings of an old man whose faith had perhaps been tested too severely by the solitude of his calling. A kneeling shadow. I chuckled inwardly, attributing it to the flickering light, the uneven flagstones, the overactive imagination of monks starved of sunlight. I should have stopped then, should have simply catalogued my pages, closed the heavy oak door behind me, and never given the old man's words another thought. But my curiosity, that insatiable hunger that had driven me from dusty provincial libraries to the very heart of the Vatican's forbidden archives, would not let it rest. A kneeling shadow that isn't the body's. It was a puzzle, a cryptic riddle waiting to be solved. Each night, as I meticulously arranged the brittle pages, my eyes would dart to the corners of the chapel, to the dark recesses where the candlelight struggled to penetrate. I told myself I was just observing the play of light, the physics of illumination. I convinced myself that I was merely disproving the old man's superstitious warnings. And then I saw it. It wasn't a trick of the light, nor an uneven surface. It was faint at first, barely perceptible, a deeper pooling of darkness near the ancient altar, distinct from the long, stretched shadow of the empty prie-dieu. It was there, a hunched form, undeniably kneeling, even though nothing tangible occupied that space. My heart gave a strange, sickening lurch. I rationalized it, of course. Perhaps a faint stain on the stone, a trick of a stray beam. But the longer I looked, the more defined it became, a silhouette of such profound, abject prayer that it radiated a palpable, oppressive sorrow. My academic instinct, that desperate need to categorize and explain, began to override the primal fear coiling in my gut. I leaned forward, my eyes straining, trying to discern its edges, its form. That was my mistake. That was the moment I crossed the threshold. To observe is one thing, to seek to understand is to acknowledge. As my gaze fixed upon it, a cold, creeping sensation bloomed in my chest. The kneeling shadow shimmered, an impossible ripple of pure darkness. Slowly, agonizingly, it began to rise. It didn't stretch or distort like a normal shadow. It elongated, gaining dimension, detaching itself from the floor as if shedding an invisible skin. My breath hitched. The air in the chapel grew colder, a bone-chilling vacuum of despair. I felt a sudden, profound vertigo, as if the very ground beneath me had shifted. And then its lips began to move. Or rather, the place where its lips should be, a darker crease in the already profound darkness of its form, began to articulate. There was no sound, not at first. No audible whisper, no rustling of air. But the sound wasn't meant for my ears, you see. It was meant for my mind. A resonant hum, a vibration that thrummed against the inside of my skull, a prayer so ancient, so utterly alien, that it felt like an incision into my very soul. Fragments of it were Latin, twisted and archaic, woven with phonemes I had never encountered, words that felt less like language and more like the gritting of geological plates, the lament of forgotten eons. Sursum corda, non ad coelum, est ad abyssum, quod, jacet sub velo. I remember those fragments, those blasphemous inversions of sacred texts. The shadow, now fully upright, taller than any man, turned its featureless head towards me. And I knew, with a certainty that froze the blood in my veins, that it knew me. It knew my name, my lineage, my every unspoken thought, every nascent doubt that had ever plagued me. The silent prayer intensified, no longer a hum, but a torrent of ancient dread pouring directly into my consciousness. It wasn't just its prayer. It was my prayer now too, an involuntary echo resonating in the hollows of my mind, calling out to entities I could not name, for purposes I dared not contemplate. It was recounting rituals, dark liturgies, names that surely summon what should never be called. I was a vessel, an unwilling conduit for a devotion long forgotten by the living, a devotion perhaps never meant for the living. Panic clawed at my throat, but my body felt paralyzed, my eyes locked onto that abyssal form. I should have turned away, should have screamed, should have fled, but I was tethered, bound by the terrible knowledge that was now being implanted within me. The prayers it spoke were not just words. They were truths, horrific revelations about the true nature of this world, about the forces that truly held sway, concealed behind centuries of Vatican secrecy and meticulously constructed narratives. It revealed the real purpose of the chapel of the veiled sacrament, not as a place of contemplation, but as a silent sentinel, a seal, a prison. And by acknowledging its shadow, I had not only breached the prison, but I had perhaps become one of its inmates. The shadow's silent prayer continued, an endless litany of cosmic horror, each syllable etching itself deeper into my terrified psyche. It was teaching me, unwillingly, what it knew, and what it knew was unspeakable. It knew the flaws in the tapestry of reality, the names of the weavers, the threads that could be pulled to unravel everything. I felt my mind cracking, unable to contain the sheer weight of such forbidden wisdom. My ordered world, the one built on reason and scholarly pursuit, crumbled into dust. All that remained was the chilling certainty that I was irrevocably changed, tainted, a pawn in a game I had not even known existed, now played by entities whose shadows were more substantial than my own flesh. The candlelight still flickers, but the darkness has now settled not just around me, but within me. I see its kneeling form even when it isn't physically present, a spectral impression burned into my retinas, a constant reminder of the ancient, terrible knowledge I now carry. It is still praying, silently, eternally, through me, through the very air I breathe, calling out to what lies beyond the veil. And I am its echo, its living testament, its unholy reliquary. The weight of its whispered prayers is a constant companion now, a chilling reminder that I sought answers I was never meant to find. The air in the old basilica is thick with the scent of aged incense and centuries of unspoken grief, a heavy perfume clinging to the vaulted ceilings and the dust motes dancing in the meager light filtering through stained glass. I find myself drawn to the darkest corner, where the shadows pool like ink, hiding what few pilgrims still brave this forgotten wing of the edifice. It's here, tucked away, that the confessional booth stands, a relic from an era when faith was a heavier cloak and sin a more tangible burden. Its dark, polished wood, gleaming dully in the gloom, seems to absorb all light, reflecting nothing but the vague outline of my own hesitant form. The carvings on its panels are almost eroded, smoothed by countless trembling hands, each seeking absolution, or perhaps merely seeking to unburden themselves of a truth too heavy to carry alone. I know the stories, of course. The hushed warnings passed down through generations of those who, like me, delve into the archives, the forgotten texts, the appendices to the codex gigas that never made it into public display. The lore of this particular confessional is unlike any other. They say it is ancient, predating even the current structures, built upon foundations that whispered of forgotten gods and older, crueler deities. The legends speak of how it doesn't just receive confessions, it extracts them, tearing them from the soul with an unholy precision that beggars belief. I should have stopped then, should have turned my back and walked away, but the pull of the forbidden, the lure of another unraveling mystery, was too strong, too deeply ingrained in my very being. This hunger for knowledge, this relentless pursuit of what is hidden, has always been my curse, and now it feels like my damnation. I've spent months now poring over the Liber Nigrum Secretum, a text I was assured was destroyed in the sack of Rome, only to find a single, crumbling copy hidden behind a false panel in the Apostolic Library's most restricted section. Its pages, stiff with age and stained with something that looks suspiciously like dried blood, detail obscure rituals, forgotten incantations, and fragmented warnings about places where the veil between worlds thins. One particular entry, a hastily scrawled addendum in the margin, referenced the speaking booth of the unseen and the chilling directive, Numquam quae qui respondit, nam non est vox hominis, never ask who answers, for it is not the voice of man. The seventh rule, they called it, a decree from a bygone age that I in my hubris dismissed as mere superstition, a Gothic embellishment to keep the curious away. I thought I was immune to such fears, my mind a fortress against the unknown, fortified by logic and academic rigor. The interior of the confessional is even darker, a small enclosed space that feels less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb. The air is cold, despite the basilica's general mustiness, and carries a faint, metallic tang, like old blood or something even older and less definable. I slide onto the worn wooden bench, the movement creating a soft, almost imperceptible creak. My heart pounds against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the overwhelming silence. A thin, grimy screen separates me from the presumed priest, a barrier of faded, dusty lace offering scant privacy. I breathe in, preparing my fabricated confession, the innocuous sins I'd rehearsed to test the waters, to merely observe. But before I could even formulate the first, trembling word, a voice fills the small space. It is not a whisper, nor a shout, but an invasive presence, a sound that resonates not in my ears, but directly within the hollows of my skull. It is deep, resonant, and utterly devoid of human warmth, yet it carries the undeniable weight of ancient knowing. "You lie," it says, the words feeling carved into my very bones. You stand here, cloaked in fabricated piety, while the true shadows of your soul writhe. You speak of trivial avarice, while the sin of forbidden knowledge festers within you, poisoning your spirit. My breath catches in my throat. The words are not just an accusation, they are a statement of fact, a revelation. It knows. How could it know? My research, my hidden delving into texts no living soul should touch, my quiet appropriation of forbidden Vatican secrets, these were not things I'd ever confessed, not even to myself in the darkest hours of my self-reflection. My carefully constructed persona, the academic pursuit, shattered in an instant. The voice continues, its tone unchanging, unwavering, yet each word a precise cut. You sought the secretum, did you not? The names hidden in the appendices, the chance for what should not be summoned. You thought to merely observe, to catalogue, to understand. But understanding such things is a sin of presumption, a theft from the very fabric of reality. My hands clench, knuckles white, against the rough wood of the bench. The terror that begins to bloom in my chest is unlike anything I've ever experienced, cold and sharp. This isn't a mere psychic trick or a clever deception. This is something else. It names specific passages, fragments of Latin phrases from the Liber Nigrum Secretum that I've only ever whispered in the dead of night, alone in my study, convinced of my own solitude. You contemplated the chalice of the first blood chapter, did you not? The ritual of the corpus sine anima. You scoffed at the warnings, dismissed the admonitions of perilous insight as quaint medieval fearmongering. Each detail, each precise reference, drives a spike of ice deeper into my heart, confirming that my private world, my guarded thoughts, were an open book to whatever sat, or didn't sit, on the other side of that screen. A desperate, primal urge surged through me, overpowering every rational thought, every instinct for self-preservation. The seventh rule, numquamque qui respondit, echoed in my mind, a chilling whisper against the booming presence of the voice. But the sheer violation, the naked exposure of my innermost being, demanded an answer. Who was this? What was this? I leaned forward, my face inches from the grimy lace, my voice a strangled croak. Who are you? The voice paused, a silence that stretched for an eternity, pregnant with a dreadful understanding. Then, with a slow, almost imperceptible rustle, the curtains on the other side of the screen began to draw back. Not pulled by a hand, not brushed aside by a body, but simply receding, as if a breath of unseen air had sighed through the ancient wood. And there, where a priest should have been, there was nothing. Only the impenetrable gloom of the empty space, a deeper blackness that seemed to pulsate with an unseen, omniscient presence. There was no one, absolutely no one. My eyes strained, trying to pierce the oppressive dark, searching for any outline, any hint of form, but there was only void. An utter, complete, and terrifying emptiness. The voice, however, remained. I am the sum of your transgressions. It resonated, now closer, more intimately woven into my thoughts, the echo of every forbidden truth you've unearthed. I am the silence between the sacred verses, the hunger beneath the altar. I am that which observes, and that which remembers. And now you are mine to remember. The metallic tang in the air grew stronger, filling my lungs, burning in my throat. I stumbled out of the confessional, gasping for air, clutching at my chest, the words of the ancient rule burning into my consciousness, not as a warning, but as a prophecy fulfilled. The void had seen me, named me, and claimed me. I shouldn't have looked. I should never have asked. But the compulsion, the raw, unreasoning panic forced my hand. And now I walk away knowing that the confessional, that ancient booth of wood and shame, is merely a conduit. The entity on the other side is not confined to its shadows, but is omnipresent, a silent witness to every transgression, every secret thought, every forbidden word ever uttered in its presence, and perhaps even beyond it. The rules were never meant to protect the uninitiated from a mere mortal trick, but to shield us from the horrifying truth that some things simply are, and they are always listening. And now, so am I, to the whispers that follow me home. I walk these marble halls, the weight of the Vatican's endless secrets pressing down on me, a burden heavier than any pontifical mitre. Each step echoes in the vast, echoing silence, a testament to centuries of hushed pronouncements and carefully concealed truths. I've catalogued the forbidden texts, deciphered the forgotten rites, even dared to speak the name some say can unbind the very fabric of existence. But it's the rules, the unspoken directives that govern this place, that truly hold me in their suffocating grasp. The 7 known rules, those meticulous observances that shape our liturgical lives, that dictate when we speak, when we pray, when we breathe within these hallowed, cursed walls. They were merely the visible tips of an unimaginable iceberg. I always knew there was more, a deeper strata of prohibitions, carefully guarded by the institutional memory of the church, a memory less human and more geological. I felt it in the cold, unyielding stone, in the ancient, unblinking eyes of the saints carved into the confessionals. But I was not prepared for the 8th. No one could be. It was a Tuesday, I think, or perhaps a Wednesday. The days bleed together here, marked only by the shifting light through stained glass and the unending cycle of mass and contemplation. I was performing my usual morning perambulation, a personal ritual of quiet reverence and detached observation before the chapel filled with the first trickle of early worshippers. The high altar, usually immaculate save for the chalice and paten, held something new, a rolled parchment, tied with a simple, undyed twine. It was not a missive from the Curia, nor a memorandum from the Secretariat of State. There was no wax seal, no imprimatur. It simply was. I picked it up, my fingers brushing against the aged, almost brittle vellum. It felt old, not merely antique, but ancient, as if the very fibers had absorbed the dust of millennia. A chill ran down my spine, the kind that whispers of preternatural origins. Unrolled it carefully. The script was stark, elegant, unlike any hand I recognized from the vast archives I'd explored. It was a calligraphic nightmare, each stroke perfect, precise, yet imbued with an unsettling, almost inhuman quality. And there in bold, stark Latin were the words that would unravel what little sanity I had left. Ad matutinum numquam maenat. At dawn, never stay. Below it, in the same unsettling script, a single, definitive declaration. Regular octava. The 8th rule, my breath caught in my throat. The 7 rules were meticulously documented, their origins traced back to the earliest church fathers, to papal decrees, to synodal pronouncements. This, this was an orphan, a bastard rule born of shadows and silence. Who had placed it there? Who knew this rule? And more importantly, why? My first instinct was academic. I sought out Father Antonius, the ancient librarian of the secret archives, a man who possessed a memory like a palimpsest of forgotten knowledge. He merely blinked, his eyes like cloudy agates, and denied any knowledge. The 7 rules, Brother Codex, are the pillars. There are no others. His voice was thin, reedy, but the refusal was absolute. I tried Father Benedict, the meticulous historian of the Vatican's ritualistic practices. He offered a tight, unsettling smile. You delve too deep, brother. Such inquiries are unadvised. The air around him suddenly felt cold, heavy with unspoken warnings. I even dared to hint at it during a private audience with a cardinal, a man known for his unorthodox research into obscure heresies. His face, usually a mask of detached intellectual curiosity, paled. He simply changed the subject, redirecting me with an almost aggressive swiftness to a mundane administrative task. No one knew. Or rather, everyone knew, but no one would admit to knowing. It was a secret woven into the very fabric of the institution, a conspiracy of silence more profound than any documented historical cover-up. It was a truth too dangerous to speak aloud. I should have stopped. I know that now, with the cold clarity of hindsight and the lingering stench of fear. I should have crumpled the parchment, burned it, erased its existence from my consciousness and this place. But the seed was planted, a parasitic obsession taking root in the fertile ground of my academic curiosity. Never stay for the dawn. Why? What happened at that precise moment, when the first sliver of sun pierced the pre-dawn gloom that necessitated such a dire warning? Was it a remnant of some forgotten pagan rite that the church had subsumed, an ancient dread that persisted despite centuries of holy water and prayer? Or was it something far more insidious, something inherent to the very foundations of this holy edifice, a flaw in the divine architecture that only manifested under specific, celestial conditions? The desire to know clawed at me, a relentless, insatiable hunger that overshadowed the chilling fear. I had to see. I had to know. For what good is knowledge if it remains unverified, a mere hypothesis in the face of absolute truth? So I waited. I chose a night of the new moon, when the darkness would be most profound, the transition to dawn most stark. I prepared, not with vestments or sacraments, but with a small, discreet notebook, a pen, and a pocket-sized recording device, relics of my former life as a scholar of the arcane. I positioned myself in the deepest shadows of the transept, behind a gargantuan column that had witnessed centuries of untold horrors and unspoken prayers. The chapel was a tomb, its vastness consuming the faint echoes of the distant city. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of old stone, dust, and something else, something metallic, like ancient blood. Hours crawled by, each minute a leaden weight on my chest. I reviewed the known rules in my mind, the intricate ballet of their purpose, the way they maintained an order that now felt fragile, illusory. The seventh rule, the prohibition against speaking the veritas nomen, the true name, except on the feast of the unseen sacrament, suddenly seemed less about reverence and more about containment. As the pre-dawn hours approached, a perceptible shift occurred, not in the light which remained absent, but in the atmosphere itself. The silence deepened, not merely the absence of sound, but an active, oppressive presence, a muffling blanket that seemed to absorb the very vibrations of the air. Then the sounds began, not human sounds, not even natural ones. A low, resonant hum, emanating from the very stone beneath my feet, a vibration that resonated in my bones, blurring the line between perception and physical assault. It was the chapel itself, groaning, not under the weight of its own age, but under the strain of something awakening within it. A faint scraping, like immense claws dragging across unpolished marble, seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Scini profundi, I thought, a stage of unimaginable depth. I clutched my recording device, my hand trembling so violently that the plastic felt like it would shatter. My breath hitched in my throat, each gasp a painful intrusion into the burgeoning silence. I thought I was imagining it at first, a trick of the straining darkness, but the shadows themselves began to deepen, to coalesce, not just growing darker, but becoming thicker, almost tangible. They writhed, slow and viscous, forming indistinct shapes at the periphery of my vision, only to dissipate when I tried to focus. The air grew frigid, a cold that bit deeper than any winter wind, reaching into the marrow of my bones. And then, a sound I will never purge from my memory. A vast, echoing sigh, like the world itself drawing a painful, protracted breath. It came from the altar, from the very heart of the chapel, but it was too immense, too ancient to be contained by stone and mortar. It was a sound that spoke of unfathomable age, of patient hunger, of something finally stirring from a sleep older than humanity itself. My academic mind, usually so meticulous in its observations, dissolved into a screaming maelstrom of terror. The chapel, I realized, was not just a building. It was a vessel, a cage, designed not to contain holy relics, but to contain something else, something vast and terrible that lay dormant beneath its foundations. And the dawn, the first kiss of the sun, was not a blessing, but a trigger. The light, the cleansing light, disturbed it, agitated it, forced it to remember its own boundless existence. I saw nothing concrete. No monstrous form emerged from the deepening shadows. But I felt it. A presence, so immense, so utterly alien, that it warped the very geometry of the space. The air vibrated with a silent language of pure malevolence, a despair so profound it threatened to shatter my very soul. My skin crawled, my teeth chattered uncontrollably, and a primal scream caught in my throat, refusing to be released. This was not a spirit, not a demon. This was primordial, a cosmic aberration that had been slumbering, waiting for the moment when the world turned its face towards the sun, to manifest its unseen, unspeakable horror. I understood in that terrifying instant why the rule existed. Not to protect us, but to keep it contained, undisturbed in its brief, agonizing awakening. I fled, not with dignity, not with scholarly detachment, but in a primal, animalistic panic. My legs, barely under my command, carried me through the twisting corridors, my cassock tangling around my ankles, the sounds of the groaning chapel echoing in my ears even after I burst through the heavy bronze doors into the nascent light of morning. The world outside, the bustling city, the mundane rhythm of human life, felt utterly unreal, a flimsy veneer over a terrible cosmic truth. I had seen nothing, yet I had witnessed everything. The eighth rule was not a superstition. It was a lifeline, a desperate plea from those who came before, those who had dared to watch, to never, ever disturb the ancient, forgotten entity that resided in the heart of the Holy See. My mind, once a fortress of logic and reason, was now a shattered landscape of dread, irrevocably altered by the knowledge I had so foolishly sought. And now every sunrise is a fresh terror, a reminder of what stirs beneath, of the silent pact broken, of the truth I can never unlearn. The light, you see, it never moves. It is always the same gold, always angled through the same panel of stained glass in the chapel of the Bleeding Heart, illuminating the same motes of dust, frozen in their ascent. I've watched it for what feels like millennia, though it has only been I can't quantify it anymore. The sun, a celestial watchman, hangs eternally on the cusp of rising, its light painting the hallowed space in a perpetual, unmoving pre-dawn glow. There are no shadows that shift, no slow creep of daybreak into full, vibrant morning. Just this eternal, bleeding hour caught in an amber spell. I remember the initial disquiet, a subtle prickle at the back of my neck. My first thought was simple fatigue, a trick of the light, perhaps the chapel's ancient, faulty wiring playing havoc with the sensors I had surreptitiously installed to track the natural progression of day. I should have stopped then, when the first whisper of anomaly suggested something profoundly wrong. I should have packed my bags, returned to the archives, and pleaded ignorance to the clandestine order that had sanctioned my research into the forbidden texts of the Vatican's deepest, most shadowed vaults. But I kept reading, kept transcribing, lured by the promise of unveiling the truth behind the so-called veiled councils, the real power behind the papal throne. My initial observations grew into a sickening certainty. The light wasn't merely static, it was looping. I'd watch a dust mote's dance, almost imperceptibly, then restart its journey from the same origin point. The patterns of light on the flagstones, the way they caught the intricate carvings on the altar, always the same, never progressing, never receding. It was as if time itself had snagged on a cosmic thorn, tearing, unraveling, then stitching itself back together imperfectly, endlessly. The texts I had pored over, particularly the Liber Mortis Temporalis, spoke of such phenomena of chronal stasis and tempus moriendi, the dying of time itself when certain forbidden appellations were invoked. I dismissed it, of course, as symbolic, poetic flourish. Now I live it. The others in the chapel. Initially, there were a handful of us, fellow scholars, a few custodians, even a visiting cardinal. They noticed it too, albeit with varying degrees of comprehension. A nervous laugh about a broken clock, a shrug about persistent cloud cover. But soon the laughter died. A custodian, Brother Tomas, commented on a new ache in his knee that hadn't been there an hour ago. Then he found a new line etched beside his eye, a sudden, unfamiliar tremor in his hand. I thought I was imagining it until I saw it myself. A deeper furrow in my brow, a stiffness in my own joints, a sudden profound fatigue that felt alien, not merely from lack of sleep. The true horror began to manifest in the glass. The chapel is adorned with magnificent stained glass windows, some depicting the lives of saints, others geometric patterns of astonishing complexity. Their surfaces, polished smooth by centuries, reflected us, the trapped occupants, and it was there that the lie became unbearable. Brother Tomas, his hands now gnarled, his face a roadmap of newfound wrinkles, would gaze at his reflection and see the smooth, unblemished face of his younger self. I, too, saw the man who had entered this chapel weeks, months, or perhaps even years ago. The scholar, vital, driven, utterly ignorant of the abyss he was about to step into. My reflection, vibrant and young, mocked the deepening lines around my eyes, the slight tremble in my fingers, the creeping grey in my beard that was decidedly not there in the mirror's perfect falsehood. Panic began to set in. We tried the doors, of course, bolted, reinforced, unyielding. We tried the windows, but they were not designed to open, sealed tight within their ancient stone frames. The new rule didn't need to be spoken. It was woven into the very fabric of this place. We were to remain. We were to age, but our true selves, our souls perhaps, were to remain pristine in the mirror, preserved for what? I remembered the cryptic warnings in the Codex Malorum, of beings that fed not on flesh, but on the potential of a soul, on the very idea of what a person could have been. Was this the cost of knowledge? a grotesque temporal experiment where our physical forms decayed while our spiritual essence was held in a state of perpetual, unblemished youth, ripe for consumption. The agging accelerated for some more than others. A young acolyte, no older than 20, within what felt like mere days, became a wizened old man, his skin translucent, his eyes clouded, his movements slow and agonizing. He would stare at his reflection for hours, his lips moving in silent, desperate pleas. This was not merely the passage of time. It was concentrated time, distilled and administered in brutal, uneven doses. It was the ignes eternus, the eternal fire, not of damnation, but of transformation, as described in texts considered so dangerous they were not merely locked away, but ritually unwritten from the official histories of the Church. The names, I had found the names, the true names of the entities they feared, hidden in the palimpsests beneath layers of sanctified scripture. I had read them aloud, a whispered invocation, unaware of the abyssal hunger I was awakening. My mind, once a fortress of logical thought, now fractures. I cling to the remnants of my academic training, trying to make sense of this, to categorize, to understand. Is this a punishment, a test, or merely an inevitable consequence of dabbling in powers never meant for human hands? The Vatican, with its millennia of hidden knowledge, its black libraries and veiled cardinals, they must know of this. This chapel, these events, it cannot be an isolated incident. Is this a secret prison for those who read too much, who understood too deeply? Is this the ultimate means of control, a physical and temporal straitjacket designed to break the mind, to render the truth-seeker powerless, eternal yet perpetually fading? I look at my hands, now mottled with age spots, my skin thinner, more fragile. Then I glance at the polished marble, and there I am, young again, vibrant, a ghost of the man I was. The reflection never changes, it just watches. And the dawn, it still refuses to end. It begins, always, with an unshakable certainty that what I've witnessed, what I've touched, cannot possibly be real. My mind, even now, years later, tries to construct rational frameworks, to find the logical fissure where the nightmare can be explained away as a series of unfortunate coincidences, a prolonged delusion born of stress and isolation. But the tremor in my hand, the ghost of an itch where the ink once touched my skin, they are physical, persistent anchors in a sea of encroaching madness. I should have stopped when the first whispers started. I should have turned my back on the forbidden libraries, the whispered histories of the Vatican's deeper, darker vaults, the texts that the Index Librorum Prohibitorum dared not even name. But I didn't. Curiosity, that most insidious of human flaws, became my guiding star, leading me directly into the maw of something ancient and utterly ravenous. The parchment itself was unremarkable at first glance. Aged, brittle, with a faint scent of forgotten things, dust, dried blood, and something else, something metallic and cold, like a winter storm trapped in paper fibers. It was one of many fragments I had recovered from the disused chapel, a crumbling annex tucked away in the deepest catacombs beneath the city, a place supposedly purged after some unnamed medieval heresy. My initial hypothesis was simple, a list of ritualistic instructions, perhaps for an obscure penitential order or even a nascent cult. The ink, faded and barely legible, seemed to detail mundane observances, a catalogue of minor sins and their corresponding penances. Confessio silenter, pona lingui obsissa, the silence of confession, the penalty of a cut tongue. Grim, yes, but within the historical context of extreme asceticism, not entirely unheard of. I was intellectually intrigued, meticulously transcribing, translating, believing myself to be merely an academic chronicler. Then the scrawling began. I remember the exact moment. It was a Tuesday, the weak afternoon sun struggling to pierce the grimy windows of my study. I was comparing a passage on peccatum cogitationis, the sin of thought, with a reference from the Summa Theologica, when a shadow seemed to pass over the parchment I'd laid out. The light in the room hadn't changed, yet for a fleeting second, the page darkened. When I looked closer, a new line of text, faint but undeniable, had appeared. Not written on the paper, but almost into it, as if the fibers themselves had rearranged to form new characters. Desiderium scientiae prohibiti, the desire for forbidden knowledge. My own thought, my current intellectual pursuit, staring back at me in an ink that was somehow fresher, darker than the centuries-old script around it. My breath caught in my throat. I dismissed it as a trick of the light, a symptom of fatigue. But the next day it happened again, and again. Each breath I took in that chapel, each fleeting thought that dared cross the threshold of my mind, each sin, no matter how small or unspoken, became scripture. It was as if the very air itself was an open book, and the chapel its silent, tireless scribe. I'd walk through the nave, considering the architectural choices, the obscure iconography, and a moment later, a new Latin phrase would manifest on the parchment back in my study, reflecting my internal monologue. Contemplatio profana. Profane contemplation. If I allowed my gaze to linger too long on a particularly grotesque carving, a subtle shift in the light, a flicker of new ink, and there it was. Oculi concupiscentiae, eyes of covetousness. It wasn't just observing me, it was judging me. My very existence, my subjective experience, was being documented, catalogued, and assigned a culpability I hadn't known existed. The academic detachment I'd so carefully cultivated crumbled into a frantic, paranoid self-awareness. I tried to stop. I really did. I put the parchment away, locked it in a steel box, even buried it for a time in consecrated ground. But the scrawling continued. It began to appear on other surfaces, the margins of my journals, the frost on my windowpane, even, terrifyingly, on my own skin, faint, almost imperceptible lines that faded as quickly as they appeared, leaving behind only the psychic scar of their presence. It wasn't the parchment itself that was the conduit, but the knowledge that parchment contained, a virus of information that had infected me. The rules weren't static. They were dynamic, self-generating, mirroring my every transgression, my every doubt, my every unspoken question. It was a liturgy of my own damnation, written in real time, personalized, intimate. The true horror dawned when the rules became predictive, then prescriptive. No longer merely recording my past thoughts or actions, they began to anticipate them. A flicker of doubt about a colleague's motives, and maledictum suspicio, a curse of suspicion. A moment of resentment for my forced isolation, and odium vitae solitario, hatred of solitary life. The chapel wasn't just a place. It was a consciousness, a sentient record keeper that had subsumed me entirely. It knew my heart before I did, and it committed my nascent sins to an eternal ledger, sealing my fate with every new inscription. I started to see the connections, the subtle threads of Vatican conspiracy woven into the very fabric of this horror. The forbidden books weren't just suppressed to prevent heresy. They were suppressed because they were active, alive, capable of rewriting reality itself, starting with the reader. And then came the names. Oh, the names. At first they were obscure historical figures referenced in the original ancient sections of the parchment, names of long-dead cardinals, forgotten saints, heretics whose very mention was anathema. But then new names started to appear, names from my research notes, names of scholars I'd consulted, names of family members I'd dared to think about in passing. Nomen Franciscus, ignaris veritatis, the name Francis, ignorant of the truth. Nomen Maria, sub umbra peccati, the name Maria, under the shadow of sin. Each name, once a mere identifier, now bore an epithet, a judgment, a pronouncement. The chapel, or whatever ancient intelligence resided within its walls and on its pages, wasn't just observing me. It was expanding its reach, drawing others into its terrible orbit, simply because I had carried their names in my mind, or spoken them within its unseen earshot. The final rule bled into being one bleak morning, a particularly heavy rain lashing against the windows, mirroring the torrent of fear in my chest. It wasn't a faint etching this time, but bold, stark, a fresh crimson bleeding through the brittle paper, almost glowing with its own malevolent light. Numquam itrum intra, never enter again. The command was absolute, undeniable, but it came too late, far too late. I had already entered, not just physically, but spiritually, psychologically. My essence, my very identity, had been consumed and rewritten by the chapel's insidious scripture. The rules it dictated were no longer external commands. They were the very fibers of my being, the framework of my new, horrifying reality. And I knew, with a certainty that chills me to this day, that the moment I read that rule, the moment I understood it, it was already etched into my rulebook. And now, as I recount this, as I speak these forbidden truths into the ether, I can almost feel the faint, cold tremor on the parchment in my study, the faint, sickening scent of fresh ink. I hear the quiet, ceaseless scratching of a quill against an infinite page. I am telling you this story, yes, but I am also, inadvertently, by the very act of speaking and by your act of listening, writing your name. The chapel does not forget names.